In the month after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Army's 8th Air Force is established in Savannah, Georgia. It has 7 men and no planes. Less than a year later, it is tasked with defeating the most powerful air force in the world, the German Luftwaffe. 26,000 8th Air Force men will die, more than the U.S. Marines lost in all of World War II.
Our American planes of the 8th Air Force bombed and fought off opposition in the air. They shot their way into Germany, and they shot their way out again.
Planes to halt, riddled by flak and cannon fire. The American Air Force is in the midst of the greatest campaign it may ever fight, breaking the German Air Force.
For more than a year, the American 8th Air Force has been locked in a vicious struggle to destroy the vaunted German Luftwaffe and ensure that hundreds, if not thousands, of enemy planes cannot attack and devastate the fleet on D-Day. Although fought during the light of day, few know the details and the true sacrifices of this battle for aerial supremacy.
There were about 8 American reporters covering the 8th Air Force. And every time, can you imagine this happening today? The public relations, 8th Air Force Public Relations actually called each one of us if there was going to be a raid the next day, and they would have some cryptic remark like there's going to be a mail delivery tomorrow, you know, not very hidden. But I mean, you know, we were fighting the same war. It's not like now. We were on the American side. And so we would all convene at the railroad station the next morning, 6 or 7 or 8 of us. We get in the cars and go out. We used to go to, there were just a couple of big towns we'd go to, and then we'd be met by various public relations people from the various bomber groups. We'd each go to a different one usually, but I made some great friends. Walter Cronkite was one of the people in that group, and he's been a friend ever since. I went on 5 raids, 2 with B-17s and 3 with the B-26s, which was a good deal less dangerous because they were not, their targets were not into Germany.
Have some memories about those B-17 trips?
Well, I do. I have not only my memory of my own trips on the B-17, but I can break into tears thinking about the bomber crews that were lost. I would get to know them. And, you know, you would go in the barracks and they were losing so many. A bomber group had maybe 18 or 20 planes in the crew, 10 men on a bomber. And they were in barracks, bed on bed. And they would make great friends with the other guys in other crews. And you know, they'd come back at night. They were losing 5%, and they had to do 25 missions. Well, it didn't take any mathematical genius to know what your chance were of finishing 25 missions if they were losing 5% on every raid. I mean, you got a break because some of the replacements were shot down, but so not many guys made it the whole 25 missions.
Till now, I've never really thought about my own death. I'm still trying to figure out what happened. We were hit. That I do know.
24-year-old Andy Rooney of Albany, New York, is returning to England on board the damaged B-17 Banshee. After just 6 months of operations, the 8th Air Force is suffering terribly at the hands of the Luftwaffe.
There's a hole in Banshee's nose, bigger than my entire fist. Next to me, our navigator is slumped over. I think he might be unconscious. I wasn't trained for something like this. I'm just a reporter. Everything on the plane is shaking. I think I'm going to be sick. Looking down at those damaged planes, it's tough to tell how successful we've been. Or if we've even been successful at all. I don't even want to think about the men inside. God, I hope that's not going to be us when we land. It was a nervous experience to be assigned to go into Germany
with one of the bombers. I was nervous. I was afraid of getting killed.
As a reporter for the GI newspaper Stars and Stripes, Rooney has been assigned to cover the air war in England. Today marks the first time the press has been allowed to accompany 8th Air Force crews on combat missions.
When I went on a raid, I thought about my friends back home, my parents. I was very aware how dangerous it was. I didn't like it. I mean, I was afraid. And, but I knew that I was writing these stories by the same young men who were flying, and if they were doing it, I should do it. That's how I felt.
I'm one of the fortunate ones. Of the 59 B-17 bombers that went out, 5 were shot down. 3 B-24 Liberators were also lost. In all, 80 men are gone. I run into a couple of guys that I know who had just gotten back. Usually after a mission, we get together and talk about things. But this time, none of them says a word to me. A couple hours later, I find out that their top turret gunner had his right arm blown off at the shoulder during the mission. He was losing so much blood, they knew there was no way he'd survive the whole trip back. So they wrapped him up in a parachute and threw him out of the B-17 in hopes that the Germans would find him and give him some medical attention. But they all know how slim his chances really are. It's a horrible, sobering moment. If this is the kind of hell our boys are taking from just hitting the coast of Germany, God only knows what will happen to them when we start flying deep into the Reich.
By February of 1943, the 8th Air Force has been launching primarily short, shallow missions for just 6 months. Already, nearly 2/3 of their airmen have been killed, wounded, or captured. But with all of continental Europe under Hitler's control, Allied air forces are the only military branch capable of striking inside his heavily defended walls. If they are to prepare the way for D-Day, 8th Air Force commanders have no choice but to replenish their exhausted force and continue the air war. The only question is, can they keep their men alive?
The mighty 8th. From its birth in January 1942 to the surrender of Nazi Germany in May of 1945, the 8th Air Force grew from a tiny contingent into one of the largest and most powerful air armadas in the history of aviation. Divided into bomber, fighter, and air support elements, the 8th Air Force primary mission was the destruction of the Nazi war machine through the daylight bombing of strategic targets in Germany and occupied Europe. From its first combat operation, a 12-aircraft raid over occupied France, to, at its height, missions of over 2,000 B-17 and B-24 heavy bombers accompanied by 1,000 escorting fighters attacking deep into the German heartland, the mighty 8th left an indelible imprint on history. Under the command of legendary leaders General Karl Spaatz, Ira Eaker, and Jimmy Doolittle, the 8th shattered German war production but paid a staggering price. 1/2 of all the United States Army Air Force's casualties during World War II were suffered by the 8th Air Force. Over 21,000 wounded and 26,000 dead. At the height of the conflict, it was statistically more dangerous to be an 8th Air Force crewman than a Marine engaged in amphibious assaults in the Pacific. Above all, the 8th Air Force is remembered for the unimaginable courage displayed by its members in bearing the relentless physical and mental stress of air combat.
As Armanini and the rest of the 263 bombers circle into formation, the airmen face their first enemy. At 12,000 feet, the air is dangerously thin, and the B-17s are not pressurized. Men must rely on oxygen masks to breathe. Inhaling the thin air can lead to brain damage, or even death. At 25,000 feet, the forts reach their cruising altitude. Temperatures drop as low as 50 below zero. Exposed skin freezes to metal on contact. Saliva or vomit turns to ice, clogging oxygen tubes and suffocating men. For the airmen, these are routine conditions. For the past 2 hours, German ground defenses have been tracking the B-17s by way of a new technology, radar. Luftwaffe flak gunners prepare to fire shrapnel-filled projectiles set to explode at the bomber's altitude and rip the planes, as well as the airmen, to shreds. Spotters on the ground already have them in their sights.
I can hear distress calls coming in from other bombers. One of them is Griffith's plane. The pilot's saying they've been hit. My God, just a couple hours ago, we were sitting on the tarmac wondering about what the Germans would do to us. Well, now we know. They'll kill you. They'll kill you deader than hell.